Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 292. And this time I'm going to talk about John Coltrane's record from 1959 on Atlantic Records, Coltrane Jazz. What I have here is an extraordinarily bogus 2017 release on Spiral, bought at a drugstore when I wasn't really paying attention, almost certainly ripped from a CD, so audiophiles look away now. This record is from John Coltrane's Atlantic Records era from 1959 to 1961, 2 years which are a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, they are clearly a transitional period where Coltrane is evolving from being Miles Davis's sideman to somebody who's clearly outgrowing that band, but at the same time, he hasn't yet found his voice, which would be so distinctive in the 1960s. He hadn't yet begun to really challenge listeners the way he did when he was with Impulse Records. And yet, this transitional era contains some of the very best work that he ever did. On this record, he's not yet leading his own band. His Atlantic Records were basically a bit of a side hustle, but there is a glimmer of the future on one track which does include an early version of his 1960s quartet. By 1959, John Coltrane's career was pretty much on the up. He was back in Miles's good graces. His personal problems, his drug issues were well and truly dealt with some time ago, and his motivations were now primarily spiritual. The recording output from Miles's sextet in 58 and 59 is actually quite limited because Miles at the same time was pursuing this remarkable series of experiments he had with Gil Evans. But when Miles did go into the studio with Coltrane and the rest of the sextet, he really made it count. They made two early modal classics in this period, Milestones in 1958 and of course Kind of Blue in early 1959. And what's happened overall from mid-1957 to early 59 is that Coltrane's image and reputation has thoroughly been restored and in fact enhanced. He's gone from being considered a sublimely gifted but troubled liability to somebody who has eclipsed Sonny Rollins and pretty much everybody else as the biggest deal in tenor sax. However, while he'd been rehabilitated in terms of his reputation, that hadn't really yet shown up in his pocketbook or in terms of record deals, and that's about to change. To that point, Coltrane had been recording for Prestige, where Bob Weinstock had basically been giving him something like a few $100 a record. In the spring of '59, his star in the ascendancy, Coltrane signs his first significant record deal with Atlantic Records for $7,000 a year. His initial recording session for the label was in May 1959, with a number of sidemen from the Davis Group. And out of those sessions comes, well, most of the tracks anyway, of what would become Giant Steps, which I've reviewed elsewhere, and is a contender, if not for his greatest ever record, and certainly best record outside those made by the classic quartet. So things are going great, but soon after there's a recurrence of something which was a chronic problem for Coltrane, which was dental problems. Now, according to Coltrane's biographer, Lewis Porter, there are three things that everybody who knew Coltrane agrees on. First of all, he was the nicest guy that you ever met. Secondly, he had a very, very dry sense of humor once you got to know him. And third, he had a weakness for candy, of which he ate far too much, and as a consequence had terrible teeth. So in July, Coltrane has dental surgery, which keeps him out of the lineup of the Davis Sextet for the rest of the summer. He comes back to play in about 6 weeks because he's got to pay the rent, but he's not happy because his embouchure, the connection between the mouth and the mouthpiece and how the mouth forms around the mouthpiece and so on, had been altered. And it takes him about 6 months before he's ready to go back into the recording studio, bearing in mind that he still has not yet completed his first record for his new label. But he does get back to gigging in the very late summer, and for most of that fall, he spends his time with Miles and the sextet, and he was also practicing furiously. Now, Coltrane was always a chronic practicer, but now he had even more reason to do so. He had to sort out his embouchure, and he was also exploring some technical advances on his horn, always trying to push the envelope one way or another. And in particular, what he was interested in 1959 was the use of multiphonics. Now, I'm no sax player, so I'm not about to explain how multiphonics are produced, but I can say what it is, which is the ability to play more than one note simultaneously on an instrument which is typically expected only to produce one note at a time. In other words, playing a chord on the saxophone. Coltrane, of course, is not the only sax player to use multiphonics. Herschel Evans did it with Basie in the 1930s, and Michael Brecker really went to town with multiphonics in the 1970s and 80s. But Coltrane, given the role and the prominence of the soloist in 1950s and 1960s jazz, really brought perhaps the greatest attention to the technique. So by November 1959, he's got his embouchure sorted out, he's been working on these different techniques, and he's ready to record again. One other thing happens around this time, which really plants something in his brain, and that is the appearance of Ornette Coleman and his quartet at the 5 spot. Now, I've talked about this on some other reviews and other videos, Suffice it to say, this was a seminal event in the development of free jazz, certainly on the East Coast, and made an enormous impression. It alienated a lot of the jazz establishment in New York, but Coltrane was absolutely smitten with this sound and with the innovation of this group. However, his moves towards the avant-garde weren't going to happen quite yet. He had yet to finish his first record for Atlantic, and Nisui Ertegun, his producer, wanted a second one as well. So in the late fall of 1959, Coltrane goes to Atlantic Studios in New York to make this record. Coltrane Jazz is a slightly cobbled together release, pieced together from 3 different recording sessions, all recorded at Atlantic Studios and all under the supervision of Nisui Ertegun. On November 24th, 1959, Coltrane goes into the studio with Jimmy Cobb on drums, Paul Chambers on bass, and Wynton Kelly on piano, and they make 2 tracks, Little Old Lady and I'll Wait and Pray. On December 2nd, the same 4 players go into the studio to make My Shining Hour, Fifth House, Harmonique, and Like Sunny, and that session also produces Naima, which was the name of Coltrane's first wife, which ends up being the very last track included on Giant Steps and allows the label to put out Giant Steps the next month. And as Giant Steps is released in January 1960, that late winter and early spring becomes quite tumultuous for Coltrane because the acclaim he's getting makes it finally clear that he's completely outgrown the Davis Sextet. Davis persuades him to go on, if not quite an ill-fated, at least a fairly spectacular tour of Europe in March and April, and in mid-April 1960, he leaves Davis for good. The first thing he does is lure McCoy Tyner, who's playing piano for the Jazztet, led by Art Farmer and Benny Golson. He also brings in Elvin Jones, the drummer from Detroit, and a bass player who wouldn't last long with his quartet, Steve Davis. With that group, he heads into the studio. He's already starting to think about his next record after this one, which is going to be My Favorite Things, but he needs one more track for this record, and that track is Village Blues, which is recorded with that prototype early version of his 1960s quartet. All but one of the tracks in this record have Coltrane playing with Chambers, Kelly, and Cobb, 3 players he was very familiar with, having played with them so much with Miles Davis. And that includes the first track, Little Old Lady. This is a standard. It's got some lovely bluesy piano from Wynton Kelly. It's basically straight ahead, hard bop. Coltrane allows himself, if not quite, sheets of sound, napkins of sound. But then we have Village Blues, which is a remarkable contrast because this is the one track which was recorded with 3/4 of the classic Coltrane Quartet from the 1960s. For me, the real marker of what's different between this track and the rest of the tracks in the record is the playing of McCoy Tyner. The next track is My Shining Hour. We're back to the bluesy, cheery, hard bop. Coltrane's style and approach is so well honed here. I can understand why the conservative critics got so upset with him in the early 1960s. They were bereaved just because he's so good at playing this particular approach. The final track on side 1 is Fifth House. It sounds different, and the reason is that Coltrane is using changes based on thirds rather than fourths and fifths. It has an almost Middle Eastern feel, and these, of course, are the changes which are known as Coltrane changes. Side 2 starts with Harmonique, which is a great track and also a famous track because this is a track where Coltrane really lays out his use of multiphonics. To my ears, at this stage, this is more of a novelty piece and something that really has sonic appeal. But that said, it doesn't dominate the track, and the track itself is great. Like Sunny is a Coltrane original, and it's a tribute to his good friend and contemporary Sonny Rollins. What Coltrane does in this track is take a lick that Rollins had used in a track on a record by Kenny Dorham called Jazz Contrast, and the track is My Old Flame. Takes it and looks at it and plays with it from all kinds of different angles. Next up is a standard, I'll Wait and Pray. The fluidity and his technical development here is so in evidence. This is as much of a statement of how much he'd progressed in the last couple of years as anything I think on Giant Steps. The final track, Some Other Blues, is a Coltrane original. Another great track, maybe not quite as experimental as some other parts of the record, but Coltrane still holds you in his spell. This record is a very diverse listening experience, and so much about it is interesting. When you read about it, there's a lot of attention played to the whole multiphonic thing. Better to focus on the great, great music which is being played here. As a record, it might not quite have had the impact or be quite as coherent as Giant Steps, but it's still a remarkable entry in a period of time where Coltrane was undergoing tremendous growth. And for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.